He made America laugh, sing, and dance. But when the show ended, they still made him leave through the kitchen door. May 16th, 1990. In Beverly Hills, Sammy Davis Jr. died at 64, his body finally surrendering to the throat cancer that had stolen his voice months earlier. The man who had spent his entire life performing, singing, dancing, acting, doing impressions, making people laugh, died in silence, unable to speak the final words that might have made sense of a life lived in impossible contradictions. They called him Mr. Show Business, the world's greatest entertainer, the Candy Man. But those titles couldn't open the hotel room door where he was headlining. They couldn't stop the death threats when he married the woman he loved. They couldn't protect him from being called a traitor by his own community. What he'd really been was something more complicated and more tragic. The outsider who crashed the ultimate party and spent his whole life performing to prove he deserved to be there, only to discover that no performance, no matter how brilliant, would ever be enough. Being a star won't stop you from being a black man in America, Sammy once said, and those words contained the essential tragedy of his existence. He had achieved everything the American dream promised: fame, fortune, respect from his peers, the adoration of millions. He had broken barriers, shattered ceilings, proved that talent could transcend race. And yet at the peak of his success, when he was performing at the most prestigious casino in Las Vegas, he couldn't check into the hotel where he was headlining. He had to stay across town, in the segregated section, and drive over each night to make white audiences applaud him. Success hadn't freed him. It had just given him a more elegant prison. The irony was devastating. Sammy Davis Jr. was perhaps the most talented entertainer of his generation, capable of doing things on stage that seemed almost superhuman. He could sing in multiple styles, dance with a precision that rivaled the best hoofers, do impressions that captured not just voices but entire personalities, play multiple instruments, act in films and television. He was living proof that black excellence was real, undeniable, breathtaking. And America loved him for it. As long as he stayed on stage, as long as he kept smiling, as long as he didn't demand to be treated like a human being with the same rights as everyone else. What if the real tragedy wasn't that Sammy Davis Jr. died at 64, but that he spent his entire life performing, not just on stage, but in every moment, in every interaction, constantly proving he deserved to exist, constantly justifying his presence, constantly working 3 times as hard to get half as far? What if behind every smile, every joke, every seemingly effortless performance was a man desperately trying to earn love from a country that would never fully give it? To understand how a small black boy became one of the world's greatest entertainers and why that achievement nearly destroyed him, we must return to the beginning. To a childhood spent on vaudeville stages, to a young man who learned that survival meant being exceptional, and to a star who discovered that being exceptional wasn't nearly enough. Sammy Davis Jr. was born December 8, 1925, in Harlem, New York, into a family where performing wasn't just a job, it was survival itself. His parents, Sammy Davis Sr. and Elvira Sanchez, were both vaudeville performers in an era when opportunities for black entertainers were limited to the segregated circuits where they performed for black audiences, or occasionally as novelty acts for white crowds who came to gawk rather than appreciate. His mother was Cuban and Catholic, his father was black and Baptist, and their son would grow up navigating the complicated space of being not quite one thing or another. Too black for some, too light for others, always somehow in between. His parents' marriage dissolved when he was 3 and Sammy Sr. gained custody. Not because of any particular parenting skill, but because a traveling entertainer could keep a child with him more easily than a woman could. From that point on, Sammy Jr.'s childhood became a series of vaudeville stages, backstage dressing rooms, and endless travel between cities where black performers were tolerated but never quite welcomed. He was raised by his father and Will Maston, his father's partner in the Will Maston Trio, in a world where childhood as we typically understand it, school, friends, stability, play, simply didn't exist. Instead, Sammy's education happened on stage. By age 3, he was already performing, learning to dance by watching other acts, absorbing songs and routines through endless repetition. The Will Maston Trio became the Will Maston Trio featuring Sammy Davis Jr. when the boy proved to be extraordinarily talented, capable of things that seemed impossible for someone so young. He could tap dance with adult precision, sing with perfect pitch, mimic other performers with uncanny accuracy. He wasn't just cute, he was legitimately skilled and audiences recognized it. Could this early immersion in performance, the constant need to be on, to please audiences, to earn applause as proof of worth, have planted the seeds for everything that followed? The boy who learned that love meant applause would become the man who couldn't stop performing, who felt invisible when he wasn't on stage, who measured his value by audience response. Young Sammy learned early that he existed to entertain, that his worth was conditional on his ability to make others happy, and that lesson would haunt him his entire life. But there was something else he was learning, something that would shape him even more profoundly: the reality of American racism. Traveling through the South in the 1930s, performing on segregated circuits using colored-only facilities, experiencing daily the thousand small and large humiliations of Jim Crow, Sammy understood from earliest childhood that he was considered less than, inferior, unwelcome except when providing entertainment. "I had to smile because if I didn't, they'd kill me," he later said, and it wasn't hyperbole. A black child who showed anger, who forgot his place, who didn't perform gratitude for being allowed to exist. That child was in danger. So Sammy smiled, danced, charmed, made himself non-threatening through sheer likability. The 1940s brought new opportunities and new challenges. Sammy was drafted into the Army in 1943 at 18, and the experience was transformative in the worst ways. In civilian life, he'd learned to navigate racism through performance, to use his talent as a shield. In the Army, talent didn't matter. He was just another subject to constant harassment, beatings, humiliation designed to keep him in his place. The stories from his Army years are painful to recount. Being forced to perform in blackface for white soldiers' entertainment, being beaten for winning too much money in card games, having his nose broken by racist officers who resented his refusal to be completely broken. But the Army also taught him something crucial: that he could survive, that he was tougher than he looked, that he could take punishment and keep standing. When he returned to civilian life and the Will Maston Trio after the war, Sammy had changed. He was angrier, more determined, more driven to succeed, not just for the applause but to prove something. That he was as good as anyone, that talent mattered more than skin color, that excellence could transcend prejudice. It was a beautiful idea. It was also a trap. Because excellence alone has never been enough to overcome systemic racism. And Sammy would spend the rest of his life learning that painful truth. The late 1940s and early 1950s marked Sammy Davis Jr.'s emergence as a solo star, though he remained nominally part of the Will Maston Trio out of loyalty to his father and Will Maston. He was performing in nightclubs now, developing the act that would make him famous, a relentless display of versatility that left audiences stunned. He would sing, then tap dance, then do impressions of everyone from Nat King Cole to Jimmy Stewart, then play the drums, then sing again in a completely different style. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a demonstration, a proof of concept, as if Sammy needed to constantly show he deserved to be there. But it was his performances at Cairo's nightclub in Los Angeles in 1951 that changed everything. The Hollywood elite came to see this young black entertainer everyone was talking about, and what they saw astonished them. Here was someone who could do everything and do it all brilliantly. Frank Sinatra came and was so impressed he became a lifelong friend and champion. Other stars followed, and suddenly Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't just playing the Chitlin circuit anymore. He was becoming a genuine star, someone who could command top dollar and play the best venues. This is when the Rat Pack formed, that legendary group of entertainers centered around Sinatra, Dean Martin, Joey Bishop, Peter Lawford, and Sammy. For Sammy, being part of the Rat Pack was validation, proof that he'd been accepted by the establishment, that talent really could overcome race. He was one of the boys, part of the coolest group in show business. Except he wasn't, not really. The others could stay at the Sands when they performed in Las Vegas. Sammy had to stay at a segregated boarding house. The others could gamble in the casino, eat at the restaurants, swim in the pool. Sammy could only enter through the kitchen, perform his show, and leave. Being in the Rat Pack didn't protect him from racism. It just made the racism more visible, more painful, because now he could see exactly what he was being excluded from. "I had to work 3 times as hard to get half as far," Sammy said, and it was literal truth, not metaphor. While his white counterparts could show up, do their act, and leave, Sammy had to be 3 times as good, 3 times as entertaining, 3 times as unthreatening to earn the same applause. And even then, it wasn't the same, because applause from a segregated audience in a venue that wouldn't let him use the front door wasn't acceptance. It was a different kind of subjugation, being loved for your performance while being rejected as a person. November 19th, 1954. The night that would split Sammy Davis Jr.'s life into before and after began with him leaving Los Angeles after a performance, driving to Las Vegas for the next show. He was tired. He was always tired, running on adrenaline and ambition. But he'd made the drive countless times. What he didn't see was the car stopped ahead of him on the dark highway. The impact was catastrophic. Sammy's face struck the steering wheel's pointed cone-shaped horn, driving directly into his left eye. When he woke in the hospital, his first thought was about the upcoming shows he'd miss. His second thought was that he was lucky to be alive. His third thought, when the doctors told him about his eye, was that his career was over. Who would hire a one-eyed black entertainer? He wasn't just losing an eye. He was losing his livelihood, his identity, his purpose. But Sammy Davis Jr. didn't know how to quit. After months of recovery, learning to navigate the world with an eye patch, dealing with the pain and the altered depth perception, he returned to performing. And something remarkable happened. Audiences loved him more. The eye patch became part of his mystique, proof of his resilience, evidence that nothing could stop him. "I almost died," he told a friend, "but God left me here to remind the world of pain." It was characteristic of Sammy, turning tragedy into performance, making even his suffering entertaining, proving that he could take anything and keep going. But the accident did something else, something less visible. It reinforced Sammy's belief that he had to constantly prove himself, that he couldn't show weakness, that survival meant performance. Other people could have physical limitations and still be accepted. Sammy couldn't afford that luxury. He had to be exceptional, had to overcome, had to turn his disability into an asset. The pressure was enormous, and it was taking a toll that wouldn't become fully visible for years. Behind all that energy, all that talent, all that constant performing, was there unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The answer was yes, but Sammy worked hard to hide it, because loneliness didn't fit the image of the world's greatest entertainer. He was supposed to be surrounded by friends, living the glamorous life, enjoying his success. And on some level he was. He had genuine friendships with Sinatra and others, had relationships with beautiful women, had access to the best that life offered. But there was also isolation, the feeling of being perpetually other, perpetually on the outside even when physically present in the most exclusive spaces. The 1950s and 60s brought increasing success and increasing complexity. Sammy was starring in films, releasing hit records, performing on television, becoming a household name. He was also becoming a symbol, proof that integration could work, that black excellence was real, that America's promise of equality wasn't just rhetoric. Picture this. Las Vegas, late 1950s, the Sands Casino packed to capacity. Sammy takes the stage, launches into his act, singing, dancing, doing impressions that leave the audience breathless. For 90 minutes, he's invincible, untouchable, the greatest entertainer in the world. The crowd, all white, rises for a standing ovation, screaming his name, demanding more. Sammy bows, waves, disappears backstage. Then, exhausted and exhilarated, he heads toward the casino floor to unwind. Security stops him at the velvet rope. "Sorry, Mr. Davis, you know the rules." So Sammy leaves, not through the lobby where guests linger, but through the kitchen, past the dishwashers and busboys, out the service entrance where his car waits to take him across town to the segregated boarding house where black performers are allowed to stay. The people who just paid to see him, who just gave him a standing ovation, don't want him sleeping in the same building, eating at the same restaurants, breathing the same air when he's not performing. This was the kitchen door, both literal and metaphorical. You could come in to entertain, but you had to leave the way the help did. You could make them laugh and cry and applaud, but you couldn't be their equal. You could be the star, but never a guest. Then came the relationship that would define and nearly destroy him. His love for May Britt, a Swedish actress who was white, blonde, and beautiful. In the 1960s America, interracial marriage was still illegal in many states, still considered scandalous even where legal. Sammy knew what loving May Britt publicly would cost, and he married her anyway. The wedding should have been a celebration. Instead, it was a battlefield. Death threats arrived daily, graphic, specific, terrifying. Southern venues canceled shows. The hate mail was so voluminous it required staff just to sort through it. White supremacists made explicit threats against both Sammy and May, against any children they might have. Some civil rights leaders accused him of abandoning black women, of trying to upgrade by marrying white. Picture the ceremony. Sammy and May exchanging vows, trying to focus on their love while armed guards patrol the perimeter, while May's family back in Sweden receives threats, while Sammy's career advisors beg him to reconsider. Every moment of joy was shadowed by fear. Their children would grow up with security details, would learn early that their very existence was considered controversial, that their father's love for their mother was seen by millions as an act of betrayal or degradation. And then came the cruelest cut. President Kennedy, who Sammy had supported and campaigned for, disinvited him from the inauguration. Too controversial, too risky. The message was clear. You can perform for us, you can campaign for us, you can help us win, but when it's time for the photos, you need to disappear. The kitchen door, always the kitchen door. The late 1960s and early 1970s brought new challenges. Sammy was still enormously talented, still capable of astounding performances, but the culture was changing. The civil rights movement had evolved, become more radical, less willing to celebrate token integration. Young black activists looked at Sammy Davis Jr., performing at the White House, socializing with white celebrities, seemingly comfortable in spaces where other black people were excluded, and saw not a pioneer but a sellout. Someone who had traded dignity for acceptance, authenticity for applause. The criticism stung because it contained truth. Sammy had made compromises, had smiled when he wanted to scream, had performed gratitude when he felt rage. But what were his options? He'd been performing since age 3, earning his survival through entertainment. Was he supposed to throw it all away, to reject the success he'd fought so hard to achieve, to turn his back on the only life he'd ever known? The civil rights movement demanded that black people stop accommodating white comfort, but accommodation was literally how Sammy had survived. Asking him to stop performing, in every sense of that word, was asking him to stop being himself. Then came 1972, and the moment that would haunt Sammy forever. The photograph of him hugging Richard Nixon at the Republican National Convention. Sammy had been invited to perform, and in what he later called the biggest mistake of my life, he gave Nixon a spontaneous embrace on stage, the flash of cameras, the moment frozen forever. Sammy, beaming, arms around a president many in the black community saw as hostile to civil rights. The image was broadcast everywhere, reproduced in every newspaper used by Nixon's campaign. And black America felt betrayed. The backlash was swift and brutal. Sammy was called a traitor, an Uncle Tom, the ultimate sellout. Black organizations that had once honored him now denounced him. Young black audiences stayed away from his shows. The man who had broken barriers was suddenly persona non grata in his own community. One photograph, one thoughtless moment, had undone decades of achievement, reduced his complex legacy to a single gesture of apparent collaboration. Sammy tried to explain. He'd just been himself, friendly and spontaneous. He hadn't meant it politically. But intent didn't matter. Impact did. And the impact was devastating. For the rest of his life, Sammy would try to repair the damage, to prove his commitment to civil rights, to explain he'd never meant betrayal. But the Nixon hug became defining in a way nothing else had been. Not his talent, not his barrier breaking, not his decades of fighting for acceptance. Just that one embrace, that one moment when he'd forgotten to perform the role they needed him to play. The 1970s and 80s brought a kind of redemption, but it was incomplete, qualified, tinged with sadness. The Candyman became a massive hit in 1972, giving Sammy crossover success and financial security. He appeared on television constantly, remained a draw in Vegas, continued to perform with his characteristic energy. But something had shifted. The anger from the black community hurt in ways that racism from white America never had, because it came from his people, the community he thought he'd been representing, proving things for all along. And there were other struggles, ones that had always been there but were becoming harder to hide. Sammy's drinking, which had always been heavy, was becoming problematic. The drugs, initially just to keep going, to maintain the energy needed for exhausting shows, were becoming dependencies. The relationships with women, he married again to dancer Altaviz Gore in 1970, were strained by his infidelities, his absences, his fundamental inability to be fully present when he wasn't performing. There were whispers, too, about Sammy's sexuality, rumors of affairs with men, of a secret life that he could never publicly acknowledge. In an era when being black and successful was already precarious, being openly gay or bisexual would have been professional suicide. So Sammy hid that part of himself, if indeed it existed, added it to the long list of things he couldn't be honest about, another way in which he had to perform an acceptable version of himself for public consumption. By the mid-1980s, Sammy's voice was failing. Years of smoking, drinking, constant performing taking their toll. He struggled with notes that had once been effortless. For someone whose identity was so completely tied to performance, this decline was devastating. 1989, the diagnosis: throat cancer, aggressive and advanced. The same vocal cords that had brought him fame were now killing him. The same throat that had sung, joked, charmed its way through decades of barriers was being destroyed from within. The doctor delivered the news clinically. "Mr. Davis, you're going to lose your voice. The treatment will save your life, but you'll never sing again." Sammy sat silent. For perhaps the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. No joke to deflect. No smile to hide behind. No performance to transform the pain into entertainment. Just silence. The one thing he'd spent his entire life trying to avoid. He continued performing as long as possible, doing shows even when speaking was agony, when singing was impossible, because performing was all he knew, all he was. The kitchen door had been the exit his whole life. Now the only door left led to silence. There was a final tour, a celebration of his career where other entertainers came to pay tribute. Frank Sinatra was there, along with Dean Martin and others from the old days. They told stories, sang his songs, reminisced about the legendary performances. But Sammy himself could barely participate, could only wave to the audience, mouth the words to songs he couldn't sing, let his presence alone be the performance. It was heartbreaking, the world's greatest entertainer reduced to silence, the man who had talked and sung his way through every barrier now unable to speak. May 16th, 1990. When death finally came, it was almost a relief. Sammy Davis Jr. had performed until he literally couldn't anymore, had given everything to his art and his audiences, had died on stage in every way except the literal one. He was 64 years old, having survived childhood vaudeville, army racism, a near-fatal car accident, the pressures of integration, the betrayal of his community, and finally the cancer that stole his voice. He left behind a complicated legacy, a body of work that was undeniably brilliant, a life that was undeniably tragic, and a question that remains unanswered. What might he have been if he'd been allowed to be just talented rather than having to be exceptional to earn basic dignity? Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were there hidden forces at play? The hidden forces were anything but hidden. Systemic racism that made every achievement 3 times as difficult. An industry that celebrated his talent while denying his humanity. A society that wanted his entertainment but not his equality. And the weight of being a symbol, a pioneer, a representation of possibility for millions of people who needed him to succeed. Because his success meant their own might be possible. The funeral was grand, befitting someone called Mr. Show Business. Stars from across the entertainment world came to pay respects. Frank Sinatra delivered a eulogy that captured Sammy's talent but couldn't quite capture his pain. The civil rights leaders who had criticized him came too, recognizing now that it was too late how much he had sacrificed, how hard the path he'd walked had been. And fans, black and white, mourned the loss of an entertainer who had given them joy, even if that joy had cost him everything. In the years since his death, Sammy Davis Jr.'s legacy has been reconsidered, reappraised, understood with more nuance and compassion. The Nixon hug is seen not as betrayal, but as a complicated moment in a complicated life, a mistake made by someone trying to navigate impossible waters. The performances are recognized not just as entertainment, but as acts of defiance, proof that black excellence was real and undeniable. The barriers he broke. Being the first black entertainer to play the big Vegas casinos, to have his own television special, to be accepted in mainstream white entertainment, are understood as the hard-won victories they were. But perhaps, more importantly, there's growing recognition of the cost Sammy paid. The price of being first, of having to be exceptional, of carrying the weight of representation. Contemporary scholars and commentators look at his life and see not just individual achievement, but systemic injustice. Not just personal failure, but structural racism. Not just one man's struggles, but the struggles of an entire community trying to be recognized as fully human. Film documentaries like Sammy Davis Jr., I've Gotta Be Me, have helped restore understanding of who he really was. Not just the entertainer, but the man behind the performance. the person who had to smile when he wanted to scream, who had to prove himself every single day, who was loved for what he could do but never quite accepted for who he was. These retrospectives show the toll of that performance, the exhaustion of constantly being on, the loneliness of being celebrated but not truly seen. His influence on entertainment is undeniable. Sammy proved that black entertainers could be versatile, could appeal to crossover audiences, could headline the biggest venues. He paved the way for everyone from Michael Jackson to Beyoncé, showing that black excellence could dominate mainstream entertainment. But his life also showed the limits of individual achievement, the impossibility of performing your way out of systemic oppression, the trap of being the exception who's supposed to prove the rule. "I'm not one color. I'm all of them," Sammy once said, and it was both aspiration and tragedy. He wanted to transcend race, to be just an entertainer, just a person judged on talent rather than skin color. But America wouldn't let him. Every achievement was a first for a black man. Every failure was a black failure. Every moment of his life was racialized whether he wanted it to be or not. He couldn't just be Sammy Davis Jr. He had to be Sammy Davis Jr., black entertainer, racial pioneer, symbol of integration, proof that the system worked even as it was grinding him down. The tragedy isn't that Sammy Davis Jr. died at 64. The tragedy is that he spent those 64 years performing, not just on stage, but in every interaction, every moment, constantly proving he deserved to exist, to be loved, to be accepted. He gave America everything, his talent, his joy, his very self. And in return, America applauded while keeping him at a distance, loved his performances while denying his humanity, made him a star while reminding him daily that being a star wouldn't stop him from being a black man in America. "I had to smile because if I didn't, they'd kill me," Sammy said, and he smiled his whole life. He smiled through racism and rejection, through pain and humiliation, through barriers and betrayals. He smiled because smiling was survival, because being likable was protection, because his smile made white audiences comfortable enough to let him on their stages even if they wouldn't let him in their hotels. And that smile made him one of the greatest entertainers who ever lived, and killed him from the inside, because you can't smile through everything, can't perform your way through every pain, can't be exceptional enough to transcend systemic oppression. The questions his life poses remain urgent. What do we demand of our black artists? What price do we make them pay for success? When we celebrate their achievements, do we see the cost? And when we ask them to be twice as good to get half as far, do we understand that we're asking them to destroy themselves to earn what should have been theirs by right? May 16, 1990. When death finally came, it was almost a relief. Sammy Davis Jr. had performed until he literally couldn't anymore, had given everything to his art and his audiences, had died on stage in every way except the literal one. He left behind a complicated legacy, a body of work that was undeniably brilliant, a life that was undeniably tragic, and questions that remain unanswered. What might he have been if he'd been allowed to be just talented rather than having to be exceptional to earn basic dignity? The funeral was grand, befitting Mr. Show Business. Stars from across entertainment came to pay respects. Frank Sinatra delivered a eulogy that captured Sammy's talent but couldn't quite capture his pain. Civil rights leaders who had criticized him came too, recognizing now, too late, how much he had sacrificed, how hard the path he'd walked had been. And fans, black and white, mourned the loss of an entertainer who had given them joy, even if that joy had cost him everything. Sammy Davis Jr. turned his entire life into a stage, and when the curtain fell, America realized they had never actually seen the man behind the smile. They had loved the performance, the singing, the dancing, the jokes, the impressions. But the person performing, the boy from Harlem who learned to smile or die, The man who worked 3 times as hard to get half as far? The human being who just wanted to be treated as equal? That person had remained invisible, hidden behind the very brilliance that made him famous. The kitchen door had been his exit his entire life, the constant reminder that no matter how talented, how successful, how beloved, he would never be allowed to stay. And in the end, that's what killed him. Not the cancer, but the weight of performing worthiness every single day, of proving his right to exist, of smiling through the hatred, of being exceptional when he just wanted to be human. The questions his life poses remain urgent. What do we demand of our black artists? What price do we make them pay for success that should be theirs by right? When we stand and applaud, do we see the person or just the performance? And how many Sammy Davis Jr.'s are still being told to leave through the kitchen door, to work 3 times as hard, to smile even when it kills them? In our age where we claim to celebrate diversity, where we perform allyship on social media, where we tout progress, are we still making people earn basic humanity through exceptional performance? Are we still applauding the show while maintaining the segregation? Have we finally opened the front door, or just gotten better at disguising the kitchen entrance? Sammy Davis Jr. made America laugh, sing, and dance. He broke barriers, paved the way, proved that black excellence was undeniable, and America made him pay for it with everything he had: his peace, his dignity, his voice, his life. They loved him as an entertainer, but never quite accepted him as a person. They celebrated his performances, but maintained the boundaries. They gave him every award except the one that mattered, the right to simply exist without having to constantly prove he deserved to. The standing ovations meant nothing. The awards meant nothing. The fame meant nothing. Because at the end of every performance, he still had to leave through the kitchen door. And eventually, inevitably, that destroyed him. Not just the racism itself, but the exhaustion of performing dignity instead of being given it, of earning respect that should have been automatic, of proving his humanity when it should have been assumed. Sammy Davis Jr. was the greatest entertainer America produced, and America made him pay for it with his life. He showed us that talent alone cannot overcome systemic racism, that individual excellence cannot fix structural injustice, that you can be loved and still not be seen, that you can break every barrier and still be kept outside. The final curtain has fallen. The applause has faded, and if we listen carefully to the silence that remains, we might finally hear what Sammy was trying to tell us all along. That behind every smile there was pain, that behind every performance there was a person, that behind the greatest entertainer in the world was just a man who wanted what everyone wants: to be valued not for what he could do, but for who he was. But we weren't listening then. The question is, are we listening now?